Hey everybody, welcome back to Jim's Stream of Thought, and welcome to my fourth attempt to record a video documenting my thoughts on the brand new Netflix series, Masters of the Universe Revelations. Truth be told, I hadn't originally intended to check the series out. I was not the biggest fan of He-Man growing up. I was always more of a Transformers kid. But my friends were talking quite a bit about it, and I saw the firestorm that this series has kicked up over on Rotten Tomatoes, where it currently has an audience score of 36%. It's a curious thing, this series. You know, having seen He-Man a long time ago on television in the 80s, and having seen this, which by the way is touted as a direct sequel to that old series, notwithstanding the fact that there were two He-Man reboots, one in the 90s and one in the early 2000s. This has been touted as a direct sequel, and the fact that it has tells me something. This series was created specifically for Gen Xers. That is my understanding here. That is my takeaway from the marketing strategy that's been adopted by Netflix and that's being implemented by showrunner Kevin Smith and his pool of writers. Okay, more than anything else on the market, this series is aimed at a very specific audience, namely the kids who grew up with the series, who are now 40 somethings. And yet, notwithstanding those marching orders, it seems to me at least that Netflix and Kevin Smith and everyone else in charge have pretty much dropped the ball. But is that really the case? Well, here's what I think. Okay, so by way of a synopsis, and here's where we go into spoilers. That's how significant the spoilers are. You can't discuss the series without getting into spoilers. But basically, the show is set on Eternia, of course. The very first episode has He-Man taking on Skeletor, who tries yet again to breach Castle Grayskull and unlock its power. And to defeat Skeletor, He-Man literally has to sacrifice himself. He has to, using his sword of power, obliterate something that Skeletor is trying to obtain, and ends up blasting both himself and Skeletor, apparently, to atoms. And this all happens in the first episode. The remainder of the series is about finding or bringing magic back to Eternia, because apparently that cataclysmic event that apparently killed He-Man has left Eternia without magic. And the only way to bring it back is to recover He-Man's power sword, which, as He-Man was obliterated, was split into two and sent off to parts unknown. So the only way to bring the power sword, the magic back, is to recover the sword of power and use it to restore magic to Eternia. Who's going to do that without He-Man? Well, it falls upon Teela, He-Man's former captain of the guard, who resigned in disgust after finding out her best friend Prince Adam's secret, i.e. that he is He-Man. Okay. So that's the first episode, but that basically sets the tone for the entire series. And as you may have guessed, after He-Man perishes, or apparently perishes in the first episode, his appearances in the remainder of the series are limited largely to flashbacks. Okay, and that's in a nutshell. Actually, that's what the Firestorm has been all about. It's a series that purports to bring He-Man back, from the obscurity into which he had fallen, but doesn't have He-Man in it. I am not going to indulge in a lot of the hateful rhetoric that has characterized some user reviews, but I will say this: there are a lot of good points, and quite a few bad points to this series too. What are the good points? The animation is top notch. Okay, I've watched quite a few Netflix animated series by now, the originals. And I have to say that Masters of the Universe Revelations is somewhere near the top. It's right up there with Voltron Legendary Defender. It's up there with Pacific Rim The Black It's the animation is very consistent. It's even more consistent than the animation of Trece. I mean, all of you know how much I love that series, but this animation it's cleaner, and it lasts from one episode, from the first episode to the very last. The quality of the animation remains the same. Okay, the second plus point, the second pro in favor of this series is some really sterling voice acting. Not so much from the He-Man actor, Chris Wood, who I don't really know, but more so from the supporting cast, headed by Sarah Michelle Gellar, who plays Tila, uh, Liam Cunningham, who plays Man-at-Arms, and most prominently, Lena Headey of Game of Thrones. Or is it Headey? I don't know. I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name. And the voice cast here really helps drive the story forward, because they do the extremely difficult, they have the extremely unenviable and difficult task of balancing the series' high camp with its dramatic stakes. And I have to say, they do a really good job, especially Lena Headey, who really embraces the camp as Evil Lynn. Oh my God, she is magnificent. Let me say this, Game of Thrones fans, I know that this is a far cry from what you guys loved about that series, but I mean, if you are fans of Lena Headey, you want to check out the series. It's so much of a blast listening to her. You'll never see her face, of course, but I mean, she does a wonderful bit of voice acting here. And if I'm honest, she's one of the main attractions of this new series. That said, another attraction, for me at least, and I believe for the Gen Xers at whom this series is aimed, is the high camp. This is freaking Conan the Barbarian in space. So of course it's going to be campy. Of course it's going to be corny. Of course you're going to be dad jokes galore. I mean, the jokes that were not really funny in the 1980s are even cornier now. They're dad jokes. But guess what? Most of the people who grew up watching this series are dads now. So it works out just fine. And the fact that Kevin Smith and his writers have embraced that high camp works in this series' favor. And finally, one thing that I think works well for this series is the fact that, especially as something that purports to be a direct sequel to the 80s series, is how it picks up plot points directly from that series. Like the fact that Tila is the daughter of another major supporting character, the Sorceress. That was a plot point that was explored briefly, I think in one episode or two episodes in the original series, and they're revisiting it. And it also raises the plot point: how would Tila, the best friend, or at least the supposed best friend of He-Man and his alter ego Prince Adam, how would she feel about learning that they're the same guy? Because all throughout the 80s cartoon, she never knew. And I don't remember why it was never told to her. I don't, like I said, I was not a He-Man devotee, but I did follow the series with some regularity. And to the best of my recollection, they never explained why the people who did know, like Man-at-Arms, Orko, etc., knew and Tila didn't know. It always seemed kind of arbitrary. And this show addresses that directly. And I think it does it in a way that is credible and emotionally resonant. Okay, so that's quite a few good points, but what's wrong with it? What are the bad points? Well, the first negative point is a pretty valid one. And I understand to a great extent the rage that has been directed against the show, because the first bad point is that He-Man is barely in this show. Okay, I know there have been accusations of bait and switch, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that, but basically, I think it's a valid criticism that He-Man spends so little time in this show. I know that the writers have something cooking. I know they have the long game in mind. I know that we're probably, we're meant to wait and see how things are going to turn out. The series actually ends on a really obvious cliffhanger. But that said, this is a 5-episode series. This is a 5-episode season. To have He-Man in flashbacks for most of it, When your target audience, okay, streamed, downloaded, clicked this series, fully expecting and wanting to see He-Man. For me, that was a mistake, a creative misstep, and whatever Kevin Smith is reaping right now, he kind of deserves. I mean, he made a definite creative choice, and he's paying for it. Now, does he deserve a shot at a second season? Well, I think so. But anyway, I do believe that He-Man not being in the majority of this series is a minus point. I won't belabor that anymore. Okay, the second minus point, as far as I'm concerned, is the casting of Mark Hamill as Skeletor. Okay, I understand that the original Skeletor actor, Alan Oppenheimer, declined the role because he felt he was too old for it, or that it wasn't offered to him. Whatever the story is, Alan Oppenheimer's out because he's too old. But I don't think that bringing Mark Hamill on board was any better. Why? Because apart from being Luke Skywalker, Mark Hamill happens to be a very prominent voice actor, okay, who's voiced major characters like the Joker or Firelord Ozai from the original Avatar: The Last Airbender series, and he has a very signature vocal style, which works pretty well for certain characters. But when you superimpose that signature vocal style onto an iconic character, it's ill-fitting. Okay, so again, that's the second minus point for this series for me. I don't think Mark Hamill should have been Skeletor. Okay, and the third, and I don't even know how many people pay attention to stuff like this, but I definitely took note of it. I did not like the generic music score that they used for this series. I mean, all due respect to Mr. Bear McCreary, otherwise known as the composer of The Walking Dead, I think using a purely orchestral score to highlight the fact that this series is an action fantasy was another mistake, because this show unabashedly embraces its 80s identity. It embraces itself as a Gen X icon. So a little 80s music would have been nice. In fact, after I watched this series, even though I hadn't heard a single note of it, I was afflicted with last song syndrome of the original 80s theme by Shuki Levy. That's the power of the recall of that theme. And it would have done this series a lot of favors if they had brought that theme back, even in some capacity. I mean, if they were afraid of being anachronistic, well, they should check out Thor Ragnarok, a movie that was produced in 2017 with a heavily 80s inspired score, and yet which worked as a piece of narrative. It worked comedically, it worked dramatically, it just worked. Okay, and that's something they could have employed here. There's actually one last nitpick I have with this show, and it's that I hate, okay, yeah, and I know how strong a word that is, but I hate Tila's haircut. Okay, Tila starts the show, episode 1, in her traditional tied up hair with a tiara, with a matching tiara. She ends the episode throwing the tiara down in her disgust, having found out that Adam is He-Man and he kept a secret from her all this time, and starts the new episode with a new look, which is actually not a bad thing at all. I mean, she has this nice tough look. She wears pants now, unlike the tanga she was always wearing throughout the 80s series. But her shaved long bangs look, it's like something out of a 90s rave party. It just doesn't work for me. I mean, I get that they're trying to be different, but there are so many other ways that the design team could have done short hair for Tila or a different look for Tila without looking like that. The look just doesn't work for me. Okay, that's the good points and the bad points all balanced against each other. So how do I rate this series? Like I said, I'm familiar with He-Man. I watched it as a kid, but I don't have quite the emotional attachment that people who are disgusted with this series have. I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. I know there are people who are gonna disagree with me, but I really don't give a shit. This series was solidly put together by people who know what they were doing. Okay, and like I said, This is clearly part of a bigger plan. They've got plans for He-Man. And while I agree that he should have been in the series more, it's clear that they're not done with his story. So to conclude that He-Man somehow been eased out of his entire series, okay, I think that's a bit premature. I know that they made some creative missteps, but I also know that they got so much about the mythology right, and I think that's worth commending. And I think it's also worth commending that they wrapped this mythology in animation that is just sublime. I mean, it looks really good. It is so much better than anything that has come before. Yes, even including the 90s and the noughties reboots. So even though the series is hobbled by its negative points, most prominently the absence of He-Man, there are enough good points to warrant a score of 7. Okay. So that's it for my review, and I hope I'm able to post this one. You know, and I'd like to hear what you think this time. And I've never asked for comments before, and I know that this particular show is something that's been commented on a lot. So I'd like to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below. And remember, if you like what you see, give me a like and a subscribe. Thanks.